Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. A new Kaiser Family Foundation poll shows that half of us Americans think the days of COVID waves are over. Only a third of us think we face a new wave of COVID infections. Which group is right? Is COVID over, or are we in a new wave? You decide. NBC News announced at 4:33 p.m. on May the 4th that we Americans had reached over 1 million COVID deaths. Yes, 1 million deaths from COVID. That's more deaths than any other nation on the planet. In fact, we've had more deaths from COVID than the deaths of Americans in all of the wars of the 20th century combined. But that's not all. We've had more deaths than our annual deaths by auto accident, household accident, murder, the common flu, and the 7 biggest wars of the 20th century combined. But the real question of the moment is this: is COVID over? Can you and I relax? Can you throw away your mask and go to sports matches, concerts, restaurants, and bars? In other words, has COVID become a normal illness like the common cold, a disease that's a nuisance but doesn't kill you? The answer is simple. We don't know. And we won't know for another few weeks. Why? COVID cases are rocketing upward in 46 states. In 5 states, the number of COVID cases has doubled in the last 2 weeks. These states are Indiana, West Virginia, Hawaii, Oregon, and North Carolina. On the other hand, hospitalizations are at one of their lowest ebbs since the pandemic began. Does this mean that we can let down our guard and go back to socializing the way we used to? Apparently not quite yet. On the positive side, a study published in one of the journals of the American Medical Association looked at 528 football games with limited attendance and social distancing and found these games did not produce rises in COVID-19. So you may be able to go back to outdoor sports events if the stadium is set up for social distancing. But most other social settings still pose a risk. For example, the White House Correspondents' Dinner took place on Saturday, April 30th. 2,600 people of importance crowded into the Washington Hilton. But unlike the football games, the event was indoors. In fact, it was in a subterranean ballroom. COVID rules were strictly enforced. Every guest had to show 2 things: proof of vaccination and the results of a COVID test taken earlier in the day. No way was COVID going to get through this defense, right? Wrong. ABC's chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, Voice of America's chief national correspondent, Steve Herman, and staffers from CNN, NBC News, CBS News, and Politico tested positive for COVID after the dinner. And ABC's Jonathan Karl shook hands with President Joe Biden, meaning that he may have exposed the president to COVID. Meanwhile, American Secretary of State Antony Blinken just tested positive for COVID. 2 weeks ago, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki tested positive for COVID. 3 days later, Vice President Kamala Harris tested positive for COVID. And yesterday, a U.S. bankruptcy judge in Delaware, Judge John Dorsey, figured the coast is clear and had his first live court session since the early days of the COVID pandemic. It did not go well. Said the judge, the in-person court hearing resulted in several people being diagnosed with COVID. But flip the coin to the other side, and you see that none of the famous people hit by COVID have died of it. Which leads us back to the reason we don't yet know if the new variants of COVID are killers. COVID kicks in between 2 and 14 days after you're infected, and doesn't send you to the hospital until 3 to 10 days after you're infected. So there's a big lag between the day the virus gets into your system and the day you are sent either to the hospital or to the morgue. There's a lag before you go from testing positive to becoming a death statistic. So we won't know if the new COVID mutations are killers until the end of May. What's more, we are up against at least 5 new COVID variants. Variants more infectious than any earlier COVID mutations. These new variants are BA.2, BA.2.12, and BA.2.12.1, not to mention 2 new variants that are taking off in South Africa, BA4 and BA5. We are experiencing death tolls of 340 Americans a day, over 10,000 deaths a month. That's bad, but it's way down from more than 5,000 deaths a day on February 4th, 2021. Cautions the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, Eric Topol. COVID hospitalizations have increased roughly 35% since their mid-April low point and are now pushing 18,000. Said Topol on May 4th, today was the largest increase since January. Topol opines that the virus keeps getting fitter and more transmissible, while our human qualities of fatigue and complacency feed right into the virus's remarkable opportunism. So is it time to forget about COVID and go on about your business? Or is that just wishful thinking? In another 3 weeks, when the number of deaths from the new variants comes in, we will know. This is Howard Bloom speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. Okay, here comes the off button.